History Lab studio.
How could we write the history of a river? Why have we regarded some animals as edible, while others have always remained off limits? Can we really write histories with places rather than people at their centre? And what happens when historians put on a sturdy pair of boots, head out from the archive, and write histories of place, region, and country? Welcome to Field Notes. I'm your host, Michelle Arrow. Today we bring you a conversation between environmental historians Nancy Cushing from the University of Newcastle and Jarrod Hore of the University of New South Wales. They talk about the childhood experiences that made them curious about the more than human world of animals and natural environments, their different journeys to becoming environmental historians, and how, in the face of climate crisis and looming mass extinctions, they maintain their sense of radical hope.
I'm Jarrod Hore. I'm a science year lecturer in Humanities, School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. And I've been an environmental historian, I suppose, since my graduate studies at Macquarie University, which I finished in 2019. I've worked on the histories of landscape photography, histories of geology, histories of different commodities and their flows around the world in the modern period.
I'm Nancy Cushing. I'm an associate professor at the University of Newcastle, and I recently celebrated 30 years there, which sort of astonished me and slightly caused me to reflect on that long period. And so, as we're going to talk about, I would now position myself as an environmental historian, but I didn't feel like that when I started out at the university. So I have done a lot of work on human and other animal relations in Australia. That's been the area that I've been most recently working on. And I've been the Coral Thomas Fellow at the New South Wales State Library looking at animals in Sydney.
So I suppose I'm someone who came of age as an environmental historian at about the same time that I realised that that historical writing was something that I was at least relatively good at and wanted to improve on. Environmental history was one of the subjects that I was gripped by as an undergraduate, and it's been a field I've considered a home ever since I kind of came of age as a scholar. So I've always been fascinated for that reason by those historians who learned that they became really interested in the environment in a different set of circumstances. And given this, I'd like to know what it was like to train in Australian history and then gradually come to understand yourself as an environmental historian. You were a cultural historian first, as I understand. It seems like environmental history existed, but that it was not high on the radar.
Yeah, that's really true. And in fact, my studies of history started in Canada on the East Coast in Nova Scotia back in the 1980s. And of course, environmental history was already a developing field across the border in the United States. It's really, where the first real energy behind the field came from. But it hadn't made much of an impact at my university. But I guess what I felt I did have from the beginning was a real sense of place and the importance of place in history. And so there we were in Nova Scotia, perched on this rocky outcrop into the Atlantic Ocean. It was clear to me that history was emplaced, that position mattered, and that things that I've learned to call affordances of a place really have a strong effect on its history. So then when I enrolled in a Master of Museum Studies at the University of Toronto, I was able to start studying a bit of historical geography on the side. And I think those are two very adjacent fields. If you can't be an environmental historian, try being a historical geographer because they share a lot. And so in that course, we took lots of field trips. There was a lot of getting on the minibus and driving around rural Ontario. And I really learned some techniques and approaches that stayed with me when I started doctoral studies at the University of Newcastle in 1991. And really, although I was writing an urban cultural history of Newcastle for that PhD, I was increasingly drawn to the aspects of that history that I would now term environmental history. So things like urban air pollution, the beaches, the highways that service the city. And then finally, I drifted onto captive animals as well. And one day I just woke up and put all these things together and thought, I am an environmental historian. So it was a real eureka moment after just reviewing all the things that I'd done and the things that were of interest to me. So it was quite different from your experience, Jarrod.
Yeah, it definitely was. As I mentioned, my training was by comparison, squarely within environmental history. At Macquarie, I took courses in both Australian history and the history of the British Empire. And the historians there taught me to be attentive to the specifics of history in a settler colony is one thing that was really important. But also to be aware of the links between colonies, nations, and empires in modern world history. There was something about this, though, that made so much sense environmentally. And once I started thinking in these terms, in terms of the political economy of certain places and ecology, in terms of commodity regimes and connections to locales, colonies, regions, and empires, once I started thinking in these terms, I think I was hooked. So the second thing, though, that was really important in shaping who I am as a historian was that I was introduced to this broader network of environmental historians in Australia, of which, you were a part. And I remember meeting you for the first time on Eastern Avenue at the University of Sydney before the AHA, the Australian Historical Association meeting in 2015.
Very sorry, I don't remember that. Anyway.
But even at that meeting, others included the group of environmental historians clustered around Libby Robin and Tom Griffiths at the ANU, who helped give me a sense at about that time of the intellectual traditions that sustain this subfield in Australia. So you mentioned that you came to environmental history gradually. For me, it was something that did useful work unlocking what I'd already learned about the world and what I was still learning at Macquarie. But what exactly attracted you to it?
Yeah, so I guess I've done that kind of inward looking, that sort of self-therapy to try to figure out why did I go in this direction? And I mean, I would go back to my childhood, not surprisingly, as so many things do, where I had a background where my family had moved from a small fishing town to the capital city of the province. But my parents continued to live a kind of almost hunter-gatherer styled suburban existence. So my dad's whole year was around the hunting and fishing seasons. We ate game regularly for our protein, grew vegetables and so on. And so that, I think, made me really inquisitive about the materialities of the world around me. So I was literally one of those kids who waited for daddy to come home from the hunting trip with a deer on the roof of the car. And I sort of waited eagerly and in an excited way when I was very young, but then increasingly uncertain about this whole preoccupation that he had and whether it was the right thing and what our relations with those animals really were. So I think that then when I moved continents, coming to Australia after I'd done the study at the University of Toronto, it just became so much more profound that I was coming to a place that was also a former British colony. So there were lots of cultural traditions that were similar. The scale of the place was similar, but the climate, the land, the plants, the animals were so different. And so that obviously made me want to come to terms with that. And I think coming as an outsider made me particularly critical of things here that I could see. I would question, why are things like that? Because I've lived through an experience where this thing is not like that there are other ways that it could be. And so I really became fascinated by how settler Australians had come to terms, or not, with the country they had stolen, and particularly with its animals.
Yeah, I certainly indulged in a bit of self-reflection along those lines as well. And I find it very interesting that you mention your upbringing, because I often think about how my childhood on a dairy farm surrounded by different kinds of animals, some introduced, some native, in northern New South Wales, and then in wool country in New England conditioned me to see our world slightly differently. I think many of the things that I was familiar with as I grew up squared nicely with those writing about environments and how they changed over time. And even as a child, I remember that I noticed that our farm was carved kind of precariously out of the scrub, that you probably shouldn't drink from the creek if the herd had just been moved into an adjacent paddock. And that work in these environments and with these animals shaped certain kinds of men and women.
So can you trace that influence into any of the early projects that you worked on?
Yeah, to some extent, though in ways that have, I think, only come to light for me relatively recently. So my early work, for instance, was on the history of early landscape photography in Victoria, Tasmania, and in other settler colonies around the Pacific that have been shaped by gold and mineral rushes. I focused on landscape photography because I was particularly interested in how people reacted to the environmental degradation that followed these moments of growth. Landscape photographers usefully for me documented a whole range of aspects related to the transformation of these places into mines, farms, or towns. From the displacement and marginalisation of First Nations to the devastation of late 19th century mining to the creation of environmental reserves or national parks to conserve parts of the natural world. I certainly recognised a lot of these things from my childhood. But the big task for me was always about explaining and recognising the extent to which people in the 19th century were deeply absorbed in these environmental matters. I think we often have a picture of those in the past as kind of ignorant vandals, but perhaps there was something in my upbringing that made me at least a little bit suspicious of this. And it's partly for this reason that I dedicated my first book, Visions of Nature, to my grandparents, 3/4 of whom came from northern New South Wales dairy or market farming families. And I think for them, as for many of us, the interconnected legacies of their struggle with the natural world and, importantly, of the fact of settler Australia's exploitation of soil and country, they're still incredibly sensitive and difficult ones.
Yeah, that's so true. And I guess when I think about I think it's really interesting how many environmental historians who may be seen as kind of naturally positioned to be really critical of what we see having occurred in the past, in fact, do have this deep level of empathy, and that it really does often come through personal experiences and familial relations and so on. And I guess for me, the most direct line from my upbringing to my work that I would draw is the attention that I've given to meat eating. I'm a long-term vegetarian, maybe not surprisingly, after all those deers on the tops of the car. But I feel like a kind of a detached observer of formal and informal rules of what is to be eaten when it comes to meat and when and how. And it's clear to me that what is edible is not always what is eatable. And I find it such an interesting barometer of Australian cultural norms to think about attitudes to consumption of kangaroo, which of course was an absolute default meat here for 65,000 years, rather uninterrupted. And then the last couple of hundred, almost 300 now, it really fell from grace in the settler way of thinking, so that kangaroo became vermin, fit only to be eaten by dogs, and more recently to be exported and eaten by others who don't have the same kind of ideas about kangaroo. So I think that is one of the research areas where I've really felt like this is coming out of my personal experience. So I think from things we both said, it's already evident that environmental history engages with the big issues of our time, finding ways to repair relationships between settlers and First Nations Australians, what divides and what unites people and places, resource extraction, sustainability. Could you say a bit more, do you think, about why the subfield is so relevant right now?
Yeah, I certainly agree that the fact that it engages with the big issues, as you say, explains why environmental history feels so urgent right now. Certainly at UNSW, where I work, there's a strong appetite for courses amongst undergraduates and master's students that help explain historically or otherwise the range of environmental challenges that humanity is currently confronted with. You know, there's now a very strong collection of work within Australian environmental history that does just this, for both specialist audiences, but also for wider audiences. I think over decades, environmental historians in Australia have developed great expertise in how people have responded to shifting climate or weather patterns over time, for instance. This, of course, provides important context for humans right now might deal with a climate that will continue changing in ever harder to predict ways. Some of our colleagues have done important work on more local or regional pressures on water resources. I'm thinking of people like Ruth Morgan and Emily O'Gorman and Amanda Wells. Environmental historians too have been attentive to contests over land use, the preservation of some places and the sacrifice of others, the ecological dimensions or foundations of empire, and perhaps most importantly of all, the attachment that Australians feel to their environment. I think all of these are very recognizable in a period of kind of environmental challenges and of climate change. Do you see this same attachment between environmental history and a sense of urgency? And
Yeah.
I wonder whether you think it's a strength or a weakness.
I think the sense of urgency is a strength. I think it sometimes history has to battle to demonstrate its utility, its relevance, and I don't think that many people question that about environmental history, as you pointed out. I'm really pleased to hear that students at UNSW want to study environmental history. They don't have the opportunity at many institutions, and in some, like my own, it's been hard to muster a sufficiently large group of students in order to be able to offer the courses. And I think that's what we found when we have run some sessions on teaching environmental history. We've found that people say they're not allowed to run environmental history courses because they don't attract enough students. And so therefore we have to start to weave in our environmental history content wherever we can. And I do that in our very large first year course in Australian history, which attracts about 800 students a year. And so I get them for at least a couple of lecture hours and can infiltrate their thinking. And these are people who are going to go on to be primary school teachers in the main. So it's a great audience to actually feel like you're having some impact on. So I think the urgency is a good thing. And it is a term that's often associated with environmental history. And I think most people might be aware of a really useful article by three leading environmental historians, Katie Holmes, Andrea Gaynor, and Ruth Morgan, called Doing Environmental History in Urgent Times, which was published in June of 2020, when that feeling of urgency was, I think, upon us all. And they really emphasized that one of the key contributions of environmental history is to challenge the binary which underpins the discipline of history itself. And I think environmental history is urgent, and it can also be radical in some ways. And that up-tipping of the idea that history is primarily about people, and that things other than people are the context for human action and don't really have an active role in history. And I think that is something that environmental historians are doing, upsetting that false binary between humans and everything else that makes up the world is one of the major contributions. And it really insists that humans are animals and that we exist in relation to other animals, plants, and the materials that compose the earth. So there is no environment that's separate from people. And of course, this isn't news. This is something that most traditional peoples, most First Nations people around the world are very well aware of and live within that set of assumptions. But it was really lost in the hubris of modernity. And so, in my view, the urgency is to come down from our self-appointed heights and acknowledge that, we are naked apes, as we've been called. Unless we can do that, I think we're likely to continue on the trajectories that have brought us to the current crises.
The point you make here, I think, about living with other species seems really pertinent to me. Over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time working with geologists in particular, and they frequently bring up that we're currently living through the sixth mass extinction within the Earth's kind of historical and geological record. Other mass extinctions like the Permian, end Permian mass extinction, which is the third mass extinction, they kind of supplied the coal that we're currently kind of burning now in places like Australia and India. And some, I think, might think that these comparisons are a little bit clumsy, but for me, statistics are convincing. There's good work in scientific journals that suggest that up to 60% of the world's wildlife has been reduced in the last 50 or so years. And when I talk to my geologist collaborators, it seems really clear to me that these historical and geological timescales are colliding. And then in a sense, what you say about modernity is that it may be some kind of interregnum, where nature and the human have been kind of artificially separated. And if this is all true, then I think that historians have a pretty serious set of analytical and empirical challenges on their hands. If nature and culture intertwine in these ways, then I think it means that a different set of sources and a different set of records are important for how we think about the past. And what do you think about this, Nancy? Do you think that environmental historians might have an important role to play in a challenge like this?
I do, absolutely. And I guess we could think about some of the key contributions that environmental historians make to historical knowledge. And I think what you've just been referring to, really as part of breaking down this human environment or nature culture binary, you were talking about your use of scientific sources, and I think that's another binary that we can help to challenge, which is between the humanities and the sciences. And so, they do amazing work in helping to understand the natural world, the world beyond the human. But embedded in that are also a lot of assumptions that reflect the time in which that science was created. And I think that's something that environmental historians can do, is to go in and we can glean both the kind of hard science from these sources, but also the soft things around that that help us to understand the period of time in which they were working. And so we are kind of breaking down some of those barriers between these two areas of knowledge creation. I think that's a really important disruption that we can make, certainly to concepts that are in circulation. And one of those is about stasis, that everything has a natural resting point or a place where things are in balance. And, more and more ecologists are not thinking in that way. They think more about constant change. And I think historians are very attuned to that sense that change is what it's all about as well. So if we try to think about Australian history in particular, Jarrod, what would you say the environmental history's contribution there has been?
For me, I think the big contribution of environmental history in terms of Australian history is to place it really effectively within a global frame. For me, if we understand Australia as a settler colony and as one among many other settler colonies, you were speaking earlier about your upbringing in Canada, notably another settler colony that's dependent fairly heavily on kind of mineral extraction for its politics and its wealth. I think placing Australia within this kind of global framework and providing comparisons between other places like this in the world is very important. What environmental historians, I think, do in this respect is to kind of be really specific about Australia's place in terms of the history of colonial expansion and resistance, in terms of setting out the unfolding of settlement around the colony. A lot of my early reading was about comparing the foundation of different states and the colonial expansion in different states of Australia to other places in the world that were undergoing settlement at those times. The really clear example is, of course, the foundation of South Australia at the same time as planned settlement projects were also taking place in New Zealand. But the one that I've done the most work on is the establishment and the rapid growth of Victoria in the aftermath of the gold rush and the comparison of that place to somewhere like California. What this highlights is a kind of capitalist and imperial exploitation of the natural world, which brings us straight back to what we were talking about, I think, in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of planetary boundaries, in terms of the intertwining of the human and the natural.
Yeah, I guess another point that I would just like to bring up is about scale. And so you're talking about And I think, in our conversations that we've had leading up to this, you're thinking big and I'm thinking small in a lot of instances. And so you're just talking about comparing colonies on different continents and so on. Whereas I think another thing that we bring to environmental historians bring to Australian history is a sense that the small scale is also really significant, and that history can be very precise and localized in the same way that ecological relationships are. And I guess we serve as a reminder that the global is made up of an almost infinite number of locals, and that they all have their own validity and importance, and that this really, to me, heightens the old adage that historians need a stout pair of boots, and the idea that we don't just sit in archives, but most environmental historians will be out doing field work in the places in which they are interested. Listening, it's a multi-sensory kind of experience of immersion, and then bringing that to their research and writing. And I think that that's a really important enrichment as well, that we aren't just a sort of book and page-focused subdiscipline. But we're also one that hasn't been static. I was talking about stasis before. And so what would you say about how the subfield has changed over the decades?
Yeah, I've given a lot of I've reflected on this quite a lot. And I think, first of all, I'm really interested in the idea that maybe, environmental historians become environmental historians through field work. You mentioned some probably pre-field work for you of witnessing your dad come home with a deer on the roof. And I was probably thinking, when I was reflecting on my upbringing, of some pre-field work of mine on the farm. But I think that this struggle to understand local places and then bigger categories like the region or the continent is something that's shaped the development of environmental history for quite some time. When I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking that in Australia, there's a long tradition of this kind of work that runs through history. And as you mentioned earlier, historical geography. As far as I can tell, it was never named environmental history, but I think it was a latent force for many decades. And I think if we take the long view, right, it's fair to say that environmental history has been kind of under construction, is the way I've been thinking about it since the early 20th century. Tom Griffiths has pointed out that someone like Keith Hancock, the originator of your stout pair of boots quote, was thinking about history, landscape and place in quite some detail as early as the 1920s in Oxford and in Italy. His work, though, of that is most noticeably environmental history discovering Monero, was written nearly 50 years after that and published in the 1970s. But at this stage, there's quite a few other historical geographers, J.M. Powell and Donald Meinig, an American, who are doing what we now, I think, consider to be environmental history quite squarely. What do you think about this kind of long view of environmental history as under construction?
Yeah, I love it. I love the concept that it's under construction, because you're so right. And I think we all like to think that we're part of something that's relatively new, but in this case, there is there are strings of antecedents, and what I think maybe it's the classic case where it's the Americans that in the 1970s start to package it together and say, well, this is it, this is what we're doing, this is a new thing, when really there are long legacies that they're drawing on to get to that point. I must say, when I did make my turn to environmental history and started going along to sessions at conferences and so on, I was really struck by how little of it was about urban history, because I really did see, I guess I was coming at it from the perspective of Newcastle and having written a thesis on the urban history of Newcastle, and understanding how important the environment was to that city. And then when I was engaging with environmental history, I didn't see people really talking about that sort of thing. There were big themes, and they were mainly around water and too much, too little, and then the very much related fields of things like drought and farming, water supply, all of that, but not really these urban topics. And so I guess Graham Davison is a good exception to some degree, because he was in his work so attuned to all aspects of what make cities work, and the elements and the context being important as well. But I think that is one area where environmental history has been a little bit of a latecomer in urban history in Australia.
I'm thinking now about how I kind of came to Graham Davison's work on Melbourne in particular, in that I think possibly I was reading it for those kind of environmental things that I wanted to know about a metropolis that grew so fast in the late 19th century and that was connected to a hinterland that was supplying gold. So to some extent, there is, I think for me, a little bit of a rereading that's going on here. And some histories of kind of labour politics and urban conservation. I'm thinking here in Sydney about the green bands. I also read those quite consciously as an environmental historian now, and notice the ways that aspects about preservation and conservation, access to space, those kind of things are really important kind of themes in that work.
Yeah, and so I guess we're showing that this was really all emerging through probably it is strengthened through the 90s and the noughties, but it was in 2013. I remember going to the AHA at Wollongong, which was about mobilities and mobilizations in history, and being frustrated because I wanted to go to environmental history type sessions and finding that they were programmed against one another because there was no dedicated theme for them or strand for them. And so I chatted with Caroline Ford, who was a historian of Sydney beaches, on the train back up to Sydney, and we decided to set up a Facebook group called Australian Environmental History, which still staggers along. It's not very active at the moment, but it was really from that the idea of having a network in Australian environmental history came together 3 years later at the AHA conference in Ballarat, when we held the first green stream. And so it was Jodie Frawley and Chris McConville and myself who organised that. And during that conference, I had some cups of tea with Libby Robin, who'd been running an environmental history network out of the Fenner School at ANU for some time, but it was quite just concentrated on the people that were associated with that school and the wonderful summer schools that they ran. And she very generously shared the name and the web presence with an expanded group that we now call the Australian Aotearoa New Zealand Environmental History Network. It's a mouthful. And that is a strong organisation, and we run a green stream each AHA conference. They're always very wonderfully subscribed. We have special events around them, and we've had freestanding sessions on teaching and for Environmental History Week and events for postgrads, for example. So I feel like that institutionalization of a field has sort of happened much more since about the mid-teens, so really only the last decade or so.
Yeah, I think it's it's a great. I didn't realize this before we organised this discussion, but it seems fitting to me that we're sitting here pretty much 10 years on from that first green stream meeting. Obviously, this is quite interesting for me because I started my PhD in April 2015, and I remember that 2016 meeting in Ballarat quite clearly. I think reflecting that I was kind of born an environmental historian at Macquarie. One of the reasons why that I feel that way is because of the green stream at the Australian Historical Association meeting. And this was a really important moment for me in 2016. I went there as someone with not a particularly good network of scholars and academics in my life and in my work. But there I started to build rapport with other environmental historians and to see energy really importantly around this way of thinking about the past. This was particularly encouraging to me. I wonder, now, 10 years on, I see the the current state of environmental history in Australia as quite simply thriving, really. Some who might have in the 1990s been fairly conventional historians of empire or colonialism, now have to address the environmental dimensions of the past that they're examining. And I think that's a really good measure of the impact of a subfield.
Yeah, I mean, recently I was involved in a roundtable at your university about cattle and colonialism and so on, and there are. There's always a new crop of historians coming through that have the kind of awakening moment that I did, that even though environmental history is very much on the agenda and, there are journals and organizations and so on, there are still people who come through and see themselves as economic historians or political historians or some other area, and then wake up one day like I did and say, oh, actually, this is really environmental history, or there's an element in my work that is environmental history that I need to pay more attention to. And it's lovely to see those sort of breakthroughs for people, and that there is now somewhere that they can go and talk about those ideas and find people who would like to discuss them with them. And so you talked about how finding the green stream at Ballarat gave you a community, and I think that environmental history has been a place of openness and embracing within Australia, and there's not a lot of gatekeeping and people. I've only experienced generosity and so on. But are you aware of any kind of intellectual debates and maybe some even conflicts within the field or beyond? What if we can't all be nice to each other intellectually all the time? So
yeah, I did find this really quite difficult. I'd always identified the subfield as somewhere that was a kind of friendly and open place to do work. And nothing off the top of my head could really I could think of nothing off the top of my head. And maybe that's a prompt for us to organise a panel or something like controversies in environmental history at a green stream sometime in the future to try and incite some disagreement. But what I did end up doing is I thought a lot about when I teach environmental history in the classroom and what kind of things I look to that I consider within the frame of Australian environmental history that might get some undergraduates kind of up and about in terms of debates or controversies. I realised that I think that typically these things are prompted by authors or academics from outside the field. A good example that I thought about was Tim Flannery's Future Eaters from 1994, which placed kind of interactions between humans, Aboriginal people, and the environment in Australia at the centre of a debate for a decade or so. And this was a question about what role did Indigenous people play in the extinction of the megafauna between 40 and 45,000 years ago. I remember that being a kind of a public debate, but it's still something that kind of triggers some disagreement among students in the classroom. I think partly because there's evidence, for both. Likewise, I think the confirmation by archaeologists of the long Indigenous occupation of the continent has forced a protracted reckoning within environmental history. And on this, Tom Griffiths has been particularly important in ensuring that no environmental history can avoid at least some engagement with Aboriginal history. I wonder whether there were, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I wonder whether there were kind of disagreements about that within the field as it was kind of being, I suppose, digested, or whether that was something that kind of people gradually did and accepted the purpose of, quite widely and readily.
Yeah, I certainly don't remember any controversy over it. And I think, as I was saying before, I think with the whole concept of country and its holistic nature sits very well with most environmental historians. And so, I don't think that has been a problem at all for environmental historians to take on board. And when I was trying to think of a controversy or debate, as I sort of arrived at the same sort of thing as you did. And it's interesting that Indigenous matters are at the heart of both of the examples that we're going to give, that after Bill Gammage published The Biggest Estate on Earth in 2011, that was generally well received, because what he was saying, he was making the very valid point that that had previously been raised. It wasn't entirely novel, but that Australia wasn't in a state of nature in 1788. It wasn't nothing but bush, as a former Prime Minister described it, but was a whole continent of known and loved and carefully curated country. But perhaps where Gammage went too far, in some people's view, was in making a totalizing argument, saying that every square inch of Australia was carefully, deliberately burned on a regular basis to create the kind of ecologies that were favoured by the Aboriginal people who lived in those areas. And so people like Grace Karskens, whose work I just adore, really pulled the focus back to the local and the particular, and said, she drew on her long decades of work with Darug people and the Dairubban, Hawkesbury, Nepean area, and just talking about that's not the case, that there are places that were protected from fire and where fire was not used as a tool. And so I think there's a bigger general point that she was making about not wasting time and effort and trying to create these one-size-fits-all kind of understandings of the environmental history of Australia, because it's just not going to work. There's not going to be one answer that to the broader questions about this. So I think maybe that was another controversy within Australian history, environmental history, where it is someone sort of from outside the field or peripheral to the field who makes an intervention, and then people respond to that.
I had reason to go back to Gammage's work just this week, actually, and to reflect a little bit on the kind of outcomes of those kind of disagreements or debates. And you're right, the environmental historians were kind of importantly placed in kind of getting a resolution after that challenge of the kind of the big vision of fire regimes across the country, and turning that into a more precise, more kind of like ecologically and culturally sensitive version. Though I do wonder whether we're maybe kind of, missing the elephant or the giant wombat, to go back to megafauna in the room, which is that for many subfields in Australian history, the big critical conflict of the past few decades has been the history wars, the public debates, which turn on how Australians should reckon with colonisation and Indigenous dispossession. As Anna Clark and others, I think, have shown, what was really at stake here was not just competing interpretations of the past, which is our bread and butter, but how Australians learn to feel about our history and the civic identities that go along with it. This was a really important period for Aboriginal history, especially, but also historians of colonialism. I think of historians of Australians at war, and of migrations and movement. I think all of these subfields, saw off the challenge of the history wars, of the public criticism of our methods and our conclusions. But I've always wondered where exactly environmental history fitted in here. And as someone who was a practicing historian during a big period of the history wars, where do you think environmental history was placed?
Honestly, I don't think environmental history had the kind of profile at that time that led to us being caught up in that very much. I worked closely with Lyndall Ryan, who was one of the people who was very much a target in that, and her work on Aboriginal Tasmanians was pilloried by Wind Shuttle and others. And it was interesting continuing to work with Lyndall, because she survived that, and then she retired. She'd had enough. But in retirement, she decided, no, I haven't had enough, and I'm not going down in that way. And she started the whole project on understanding massacre and genocide, and created the amazing colonial massacre map, which has been really transformational in many ways. But in conversations with her, in recent years, before she sadly died a couple of years ago, she was becoming more environmental and saying, look, there are direct links between massacre and weather and drought in particular. And it's during drought that you're much more likely to, we can map this, that drought is productive of massacre because the resources are getting squeezed and the tensions build up. And that's when this cataclysmic violence erupts. And so I think that's really interesting, that people who are working in areas that may seem to be quite separate from environmental history come to it. And so that's just one example. But I would say sort of more generally that before there were the history wars or maybe, prompting them, is the idea of black armband history, that historians just look at the most terrible things and have a whinge about them. And I think, environmental history, we do look at degradation of environments, extinctions, settlers coming and making things worse and worse. And declensionism is a known issue for environmental historians, and one that we do need to be conscious of, and make genuine efforts to seek out a range of past experiences and look for ways forward that are positive rather than just wallowing in some kind of despair. And I think that's where the concept of radical hope comes in, and that a lot of environmental historians have been embracing, the idea of finding ways to work towards a better future, even when the present and the past can seem hopeless. And I think that's a real motivation for many environmental historians, and why a good proportion of us position ourselves as activists as well, and get involved with national and local actions towards finding some positive ways forward for the environment.
Thanks to Nancy and Jarrod for being our guests today. If you'd like to read more of their work, Nancy and Jarrod both have new books coming out later this year. Nancy's is A New History of Australia in 15 Animals, and Jarrod's co-edited book is Gondwanaland, Modern Histories of an Ancient Supercontinent. You can find links to these and more information about the histories mentioned in this episode in the show notes. Thanks so much for being with us through these 5 episodes of Field Notes, brought to you by the Australian Historical Association. If you enjoyed the series, please leave feedback or get in touch with us to let us know what you thought. And do share the series with your friends, colleagues and students. You can contact us and find out more about what we do by visiting our website, theaha.org.au.
Thanks for listening to this very special series of History Lab, made in partnership with the Australian Historical Association. Next week, we have the first episode in a special series on Wikipedia. It's the largest compendium of knowledge ever assembled, including historical knowledge. Maybe it's the last encyclopedia that human minds will ever make. But what are the lesser-known forces that shape Wikipedia and the stories it tells about the past? Listen to History Lab's next episode to find out.